Okay, well, once again, welcome to Migration at the Southern Border, Law, Policy, Myth, and More. Since this program is being offered in English and Spanish with simultaneous interpretation, I'd first like to introduce our translator, Maria Sigourney, who will explain how to use this feature. Maria.
Hi, good morning or good evening, actually. The organizers of today's event have made a strong commitment to create a multilingual space. To that end, we have interpretation available in Spanish and English. We ask that all participants speak slowly, loudly, and clearly into the microphones so the interpretation can be easy. Right after the announcement, we will activate the interpretation feature, and if you're using Zoom, you will be able to see a globe icon at the bottom of your screen. To listen to the interpretation, click on the globe and select English. If you're using Zoom on your phone, click on the three dots where it says More, choose Language Interpretation, and select English. If you have any problems doing this, please comment in the chat box. Thank you. Buenas tardes. Los organizadores del evento de hoy tienen la firme determinación de crear un espacio multilingüe y con esa finalidad contamos con interpretación disponible en español e inglés. Les pedimos a todos los participantes que hablen lento y claro para facilitar la interpretación. Al terminar este anuncio activaremos la función de interpretación y si usted está utilizando Zoom puede ver un icono del mundo en la parte de abajo de su pantalla. Haga clic en el icono del mundo para escuchar la interpretación y seleccione español. Si usted está usando la aplicación Zoom desde su teléfono, haga clic en los tres puntitos donde dice More y seleccione Language Interpretation y después español. Si tiene algún problema al hacer esto, por favor escríbalo en el chat. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Maria. To the audience, once again, please note that your microphones have been muted upon entry, though you can control your video camera. You can also use the live transcript closed captioning option in English only that is available at the bottom of your screen, provided through AI by Zoom. Should you have any questions or comments, please type them in the chat throughout the course of the conversation, and we will try to address them. So hello again, I'm Sarah Linda Lichtblau, Director of Education at the Hudson River Museum, and I thank you for joining us for Migration at the Southern Border, Law, Policy, Myth, and More, in which Bardis Vakili, attorney at the ACLU of San Diego and Imperial counties, will discuss the current situation at the southern border based on his experience working on the California-Mexico frontier. He'll focus on border and immigration policy and how it has shifted over the years, as well as the human impact of those policies and some of the root causes of migration. He'll be in conversation with Sara Ritchie, Director of Communications for the Kino Border Initiative, a binational organization that provides humanitarian aid to migrants on the Mexico side of the US-Mexico border, as well as engages in education and advocacy. This program has been developed in conjunction with Border Cantos, Sonic Border, Richard Misrach, Guillermo Galindo, which is on view at the Hudson River Museum through May 9th, 2021, with support provided by Art Bridges. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. And I have to say, I am so excited that after so much planning and conversation, we finally are getting to do this for everyone today. I have learned so much in the process, and I hope you will too. Bardis Vakili is a senior staff attorney at the ACLU of San Diego and Imperial counties. His primary area of focus is immigrants' rights and the rights of youth and children. As a member of the legal team that challenged the Trump administration family separation policy, Bardis was a co-recipient of the San Diego La Raza Lawyer of the Year Award in 2018. He has also received a California Lawyer Attorney of the Year Award in 2017 and a National Lawyers Guild Daniel Levy Award in 2008 for his work on immigrants' rights issues. Prior to coming to the ACLU, he was the director of the Political Asylum Program at Casa Cornelia Law Center in San Diego. He graduated from Tufts University in 1997 and the University of San Diego School of Law in 2006, where he received a Wiley Manuel Award for pro bono service. Vakili is proficient in Spanish and speaks basic Farsi. Sara Ritchie is Director of Communications at the Kino Border Initiative. She's responsible for humanizing the realities of migration and encouraging engagement in KBI's advocacy efforts. From 2016 to 2020, Sara worked in community development in rural, marginalized communities in Guatemala and El Salvador, as well as led immigration education delegations within Central America and along the Guatemala-Mexico border. She has appreciated the opportunity to apply her knowledge of migration in the Central American context to her current work on the US-Mexico border. It is my pleasure now to introduce our speakers, starting with Bardis, who are so expert in this area. Bardis, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah Lynn, and I thank you for the introduction. And hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this. What I'll do is I'll share my screen and give you so you can see a PowerPoint presentation. But really, what I'd like to do today is have a conversation. And the reason we give this presentation in this way has been to talk about border issues from a place of truth and fact, to cut away all of the myth, to cut away all of the bluster, to cut away all the talking points, share with you some of the facts and realities happening at the border. From my perspective in San Diego, we do a lot of border work, and you know, we're always eager for the opportunity to sort of share what we see here out. And so let me make sure I can do this technologically before I get too much further. And do one of those. And I think you should all be able to see the screen now. So first, a little bit about who we are. The ACLU is it's a national organization, you know, many of you may have heard about, established in 1920. We have a national office that does most of our sort of nationwide work. I actually work in a local affiliate. We have 53 independent affiliates. We're independent organizations from our national office. So we have our own focuses, our own way of doing things. We're obviously aligned very much and work in close collaboration with our national partners. I work at our San Diego affiliate, where we focus on community engagement and empowerment, policy advocacy, and impact litigation. I'm one of the lawyers, and my part in this is to try to use the law to fix what we perceive to be broken systems that that harm people in their civil rights and civil liberties. And as Sarah Linda mentioned, most of my focus is on immigrants' rights issues. Most of my focus has been on immigration detention, immigration processing, the rights of people once they're processed. As you'll learn today through this presentation, through a lot of what Sarah has to share, you know, a lot of the issues we're seeing at the border is just the refusal to process. So it's actually a step earlier than what we've seen in the past. A little bit about myself. I grew up near Philly. I lived in San Diego the last 20 years or so. And my parents are from Iran. So I was born here, but I'm sort of a classic first generation American. Before we get into too much, I want to just make sure we're all speaking with the same vocabulary about what we mean when we talk about immigrants. Today, we're going to be talking mostly about refugees and people seeking asylum. That's certainly a major part of who we mean when we talk about immigrants. But we're, of course, also talking about naturalized US citizens, people that came to this country and became US citizens, like my parents, and I'm sure the parents of many of you all. We're certainly talking about dreamers, people that have been in this country for a long time, since childhood, yet lack legal status due to flaws in our immigration system. We're talking about people here on student visas. Yes, we're talking about, you know, people that work in our farms and agricultural sectors, but we're also talking about people in our tech sectors and science sectors and everything in between. Immigrants are very much a part of our the entire fabric of this country. We're talking about United States veterans. We've done a lot of work in San Diego on the issue of, we have deporting US veterans who run afoul of the law, who are immigrants. But more on a more human basis, we're talking about our neighbors and our coworkers, our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, our classmates and our children's classmates. What I'm trying to get at here is that the issue of immigrants' rights is an issue for everybody. It's an issue for all of us. It's an issue for everyone in this country. It's not just a border issue. In fact, immigrants make up about 13.7% of the US population when you include naturalized US citizens. It's about 1 in 7 US residents is foreign born. So this is very much an issue of all of our concern. And as I said, we're going to try to cut away some of the myths. One of the things you hear is that we are at an unprecedented time. More immigrants are coming to this country and changing it in fundamental ways that have never happened before. Well, that's not true. We are at relatively high levels of immigrants in the United States, but not the highest. The highest was in the late 1800s. The lowest was in the 1970s, in terms of when this was being tracked. But we're not talking about unprecedented times. Nothing this country hasn't dealt with or experienced in the past. Another couple of baseline things I want to make sure everyone understands who we're talking about when we talk about immigration enforcement. When you live at the border, I think Sara could probably confirm this as well from where she is. We are policed at many levels. Immigration has, since 9/11, been considered to be a law enforcement issue, when historically it has been a labor and humanitarian issue. And that has resulted in additional layers of law enforcement. We have ICE, who wear the blue uniforms and have police sometimes on their uniforms. They're basically the immigration police. They enforce the immigration laws in the interior of the community, of the country. And we have CBP, which is made up of 2 components. The Office of Field Operations is who you see at ports of entry, the official designated places to enter the United States. In San Diego, we have many. San Isidro is our biggest one. It's the biggest port of entry in terms of people crossing in the Western Hemisphere. So that's OFO. And then you're talking about Border Patrol, which is an agency that's existed for a long time. They wear the green, you see their picture there. They patrol the borders between the ports of entry. And although we at the border experience policing by all of these individuals for a long time under Trump administration policies, they were trying to make it so Border Patrol could basically expand the border into the whole country, and you'd be seeing many levels of these law enforcement agencies affecting you all as well. Hopefully that trend doesn't continue. We at the border don't want what we experience to be happening everywhere else, much less here. So that's the baseline. And so now let's talk about the border. And what I'll suggest, there's a lot of talk about it. Is this a crisis? Is this not a crisis? That's the current sort of rhetoric these days. And I'll go ahead and say there is and has been a humanitarian crisis that has been happening for many years. It's not a crisis in this country. It is a crisis south of our border. And it is a crisis that's been wholly created and manufactured unnecessarily. I would posit that it has been done to drive an anti-immigrant agenda. And I hope as we go through this, you may see some of that. And then as a very baseline, I always start this way, is we need to understand the nature of migration. I've worked with communities that have been trying to seek protection of this country for a long time, a dozen years or more at this point, getting older in my career. And I'd like to posit something that I think I've learned over some experience and see if it rings true for you all. It's about the nature of migration itself. And I would posit that migration is something not to be alarmed about. It is something that is hardwired into the DNA of not only all humans, but all creatures. Wherever you go in life, where a system or a living situation is unlivable, unsurvivable, the natural instinct, the only way to survive is to move. to move, to survive for yourself, to survive for your offspring. It's very much hardwired. You see it everywhere in the animal world. Where things get hard, migration happens. And there's no reason that is any different for human beings. When life is too hard, it is natural to move. And so the idea of demonizing people who are migrating for survival is very much like a first step that we need to get away from, because this is something that is hardwired into all of us. And so we should ask ourselves, as you meet the people Sara will introduce you to, and the great work that her organization is doing, to think about, what would it take for you? What did it take for my parents? What did it take for the immigrants you know to just drop everything they're comfortable around, their country, their community, the food they love, the music they love, their neighbors, their schools, everything that's familiar, to brave the unfamiliar, to brave a dangerous journey to get to a place where they know they're going to be at the bottom of the ladder, socially speaking. What would it take? And it would take some significant difficulty in order to force your family and yourself into that situation. Now, this is about myths and facts. And one fact that I was raised with, it's ingrained in who I am as a child of immigrants, is this fact of the United States as a welcoming country. Many of you, I understand, to be in New York City, so this is going to be familiar to you. But the notion of the United States as the welcoming country, that the mother of exiles bidding welcome, right? This is the famous New Colossus, the Lazarus sonnet, that's at the base of the Statue of Liberty, bidding worldwide welcome, asking to bring your huddled masses. This is the story of the United States that I have in my heart and have always had. But is it fact or is it myth? And we're going to come back. We're going to try to answer this question at the end. But is it fact or is it myth? Because you'll see, though I believe it very much to be true, this was written in 1883. I think it was put on the Statue of Liberty in 1903. And what was happening in this country around that time? Well, people were talking about building a wall to keep the Chinese immigrants out of this country. That's 1870. That's an illustration from then. Look at that picture and see if it looks familiar to see if it looks familiar to you all in terms of what we're talking about now in terms of immigration policy and border policy. That's 1870. This is from the California Constitution of 1879. The liberal bastion where I live, California, had a provision in our Constitution that said no Chinese shall be employed. That's what was happening in California at this time. In our Constitution, an anti-immigrant agenda. In 1882, we signed the Chinese Exclusion Act, one of the first and very strictest limits on immigration into this country that we saw. And it espouses the white man on top, you'll see, have every Democrat ratify this bill. So there was very much an anti-immigrant issue happening around when this Lazarus poem was written. That continued to 1910. We have no Italians need apply. It says also no coloreds need apply. That's a whole other presentation we could do sometime. No Irish need apply. This is now in the 1940s. Germans, Italians, and Japanese Americans need to register, and we know about the internment camps. So the point here is that it's a very complicated history. Which one is fact? Which one is myth? And we'll circle back to this as we go forward. But I'd like to hand it off to Sara to talk about their work at the Kino Institute so we can understand what's happening at the border right now. So let me do that, and I'll invite Sara to share her screen and introduce herself.
It's actually okay to jump in and do that during my sandwich if you want to keep your flow going, unless it helps you for me to.
No, I think this is where we anticipated you coming in here, I thought. Okay. But I can keep going, whichever works for you.
I'll let your flow keep going because I have it all in my presentation for later, if that's okay.
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 Let me come back here. Can you all see that again?
Yep.
So let's talk about the asylum process, because coming out of World War II, where we just left off, we did emerge with at least some semblance of a value in this country in terms of the asylum process, that we were going to protect people who were fleeing harm from their countries, that we were going to live up to this beacon of light. And so we created a process for applying for asylum. But let's talk about one of the myths about this asylum process. What you hear a lot is that people that are coming to our border now or are applying or exploiting loopholes in a very sort of giveaway kind of asylum system. You just show up and you're going to get status in this country through asylum. And that is very much a myth. The fact is, it's very, very difficult to win asylum, and particularly from the Central American countries that everyone is talking about these days. Going back in the 1990s, the success rate for asylum cases from Central America was something like 2 or 3%. Many of these cases just fell into a black hole and never got adjudicated. That slowly has started to creep up into the 13% range, but was still very difficult. And even in 2016, when the Trump administration's strong anti-immigrant, anti-asylum tactics started to be talked about, the success rate was still only a quarter. It was about 26%. And so that's not a loophole. That is the way a pretty strict system of asylum worked in terms of protecting people. And it's strict because it's hard. You'll see here on the left, you know, you don't just get to show up and say it's going to be dangerous in my country. You have to show that you have what's called a well-founded fear of persecution. You have to show you're going to suffer persecution, not just some kind of harm. Persecution is a legally defined term. And then it's going to be on account of one of 5 protected traits. You see them here: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. And you have to prove it with evidence. And that's very, very difficult to do when you've picked up, often in a rush to flee to this country. You don't collect all your evidence and bring it with you. And certainly people don't come with a legal knowledge about what it means to prove your case. They come and they explain the harm they suffered. And fitting it into this framework is very, very difficult. So it's not a loophole system. It is a lifeline that we've had in this country. And it's historically been a tough one to meet. People aren't guaranteed a right to a lawyer. They have to navigate this for themselves. And when they do get processed, they many have to do it historically from detention, which is near impossible. But that's if they do get processed. Sarah, you let me know when you want to jump in. We can talk about the border wall, or we can talk about sort of what you're seeing at the border whenever you're ready.
Sure, yeah, this is a perfect moment for me to jump in. Thank you.
Please go ahead.
All right, everyone can see my screen at this point. And let's see. All right. So to hopefully be complementary to some of the topics that Bardis has already discussed, I would really like for us to zoom in on the Arizona-Mexico border, because that is where the Kino Border Initiative is. And so specifically continuing on this theme of the attack on asylum and what that does look like at the US-Mexico border and what that looks like for the demographic that we are serving. I appreciate that Bardis laid out, when we talk about migrants and or immigrants, who that is exactly. For us, when we talk about the migrants that we are serving, that could be migrants in transit that have never crossed into the US before. That could be someone who was deported from the US after having constructed a life there, perhaps. But specifically for today, I will be focusing on the asylum seeking population and asylum seekers who have been subject to these 3 points here, or these 3 policies, that being metering, MPP, and Title 42 expulsions, all of which are going to be explained so that we can better understand some of the stories and some of the individuals that I'll introduce you to at the end of this presentation. So just to give you an idea as to where we are, or where KBI is and where I am, we are a binational organization on the Mexico and the US side in Nogales, Sonora and Nogales, Arizona. There are two Nogaleses, and what people say in Nogales is that the border crossed them. And so what used to be a very literally connected town now has the border wall running through the city, which I'm glad Bardis will get to talking about the border wall in just a bit. So to show you where exactly we are in proximity to that border wall, if you can see my mouse here, you can see that here is the port of entry infrastructure. And then here, this long kind of rust-colored fence is the border wall. And Kino Border Initiative is right down the road. So we are right here in this big building, and we can literally see the border wall from our windows and our work where migrants arrive. And so when they arrive, this is the building that they first see. And just to specify, yes, we are a binational organization, which means we're carrying out part of our work on the US side and part of our work on the Mexico side. But just let it be clear that the humanitarian aid aspect and the legal services that we're providing to migrants, asylum seekers, and deportees is absolutely happening on the Mexico side. If they could be in the US, we would have less need for our work, but because they're on the Mexico side and being sent, expelled, or returned to Sonora, that is where we have placed this migrant outreach center to be able to tend to their needs. But for the sake of keeping us on topic for today and talking about who are the asylum seekers that we're encountering and what are the policies that are keeping them in a crisis-like situation along the US-Mexico border, we're going to talk a little bit more about the dismantling of asylum and those three policies that were mentioned on the first slide of metering, MPP, and Title 42. But to truly encapsulate what it has felt like for us on the US-Mexico border, at least during the Trump era, I have two headlines that I would like to read, both from Mother Jones that came out just several months ago in the fall, that were exploring this idea of how asylum truly is dead at the moment, and because of the policies that the Trump administration implemented during those 4 years. And so just to read these aloud to kind of get us in focus as to how it's been dismantled, I'll read this one here. America's immigration system was already broken. Trump made a weapon out of its shards. He didn't invent the cruelty, he just cherished it. And we see these shards with both his face and Stephen Miller's face, who was really his right-hand man in creating a political machine that did cut off and choke off asylum at the US-Mexico border. And then looking at one other headline, again from Mother Jones, asylum is dead and the myth of American decency died with it. Donald Trump took a broken system and turned it into a machine of unchecked cruelty. And those are very dark titles and subtitles subtitles, and that is on purpose. I don't know if there is a way to fully encapsulate the bleakness and the crisis-like situation that has been created along the border, that has been exacerbated by the Trump administration, that is now the obstacles that the current administration is inheriting. But just to recap some of what Bardis was explaining earlier in this idea of American decency, or the American decency of asylum, in the briefest of history lessons possible, the idea of asylum does go back to World War II and the Holocaust, and more specifically what came after, when in 1951, nations came together at the United Nations Convention and pretty much asked the question, how could we let such a thing happen? There was a population that arrived at our doorstep that asked for protection and they were turned away. So how can we make it that that doesn't happen again? And so the United States, a couple decades later, but eventually with the 1980 Refugee Act, was able to codify its asylum law and determine who is an asylum seeker. And Bardis already touched on these points, that someone seeking asylum has already suffered persecution or has a well-founded fear that they will suffer persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership to a particular social group, or political opinion. And so to first understand how that specifically has been dismantled and why those three policies that I mentioned earlier are such an attack to this idea of not turning away someone who is seeking protection, we first need to look at what seeking asylum at the border looked like before Trump. And so at the US-Mexico border, a migrant would either present themselves at a port of entry or a designated place along the border where, as Bardis mentioned, CBP would be operating, or they would be apprehended on US soil. But regardless of whether an asylum seeker would present themselves at a port of entry or be apprehended on US soil, they do have the right to express some sort of fear. And if they do express fear of returning to their country, by law, they are to undergo a credible fear interview to determine if their fear is credible. And as Bardis mentioned earlier, when someone flees their home country, and perhaps they're doing so last minute without planning. So someone's not planning to flee their country. They're not necessarily going to arrive at our doorstep with all of the documentation that they might need or the knowledge or ability to fight or present their case, which is why it's important to note that this initial interview, the credible fear interview, is not determining if they're getting asylum or not. It is just to determine if their fear is somewhat credible. And with that information, they will be granted a court date. And then they will have that chance later on in court, usually through a process that takes years, to determine if they should be granted relief or asylum. And it's during those proceedings that they'll present documentation. They might get representation. But I just want it to be very clear that this interview that they're going through with USCIS is actually a fairly low bar, because the US does not want to accidentally return someone to harm, or at least that's what US asylum law says. So then once they pass their credible fear interview, asylum seekers are given that court date again. They'll go through their proceedings later. And then the thing to remember here is that they are waiting for those court dates in the US, not from their home country, not from the place in which they were seeking asylum, not on the US's doorstep or in Mexico, rather in the US, where they can get access to representation if they so choose, and they can have that at least peace of mind of not being persecuted any longer. and they'll wait for those asylum proceedings. So how asylum changed in the Trump era? We'll first look at what metering is or was. So metering is essentially creating a wait room for asylum, or it's a waiting list for asylum. Specifically in Nogales, it was managed at the port of entry by Mexican officials. And it was a handwritten notebook where if someone, an asylum seeker, were to arrive at the port of entry, express that fear that they have the legal right and the human right to express, instead of being processed, they were told, no, there's a wait list right now. You can put your name on the list. We'll give you a number and we will call your number when we're ready for you. And this is something that the US implemented, but outsourced that work to Mexican officials or Mexican entities to keep the list for them. And then the US government would not indicate how long the wait would be. They wouldn't indicate how many asylum seekers would be allowed to enter the US daily. It would change. So it was impossible to predict if someone was going to put their name on the wait list today, how many weeks or months it might take for their number to finally be called. Beyond metering, then we saw the implementation of MPP. And just to kind of put us, orient us to some sort of timeline, metering in Nogales began in 2018. And then we saw the implementation of MPP specifically in Nogales in 2020. And so it was a program that was rolled out along the US-Mexico border, hitting different ports of entry at different times, but just to focus on Nogales specifically, this was a policy that came to us in 2020, although it was a policy created and implemented elsewhere at other ports of entry in 2019. And so MPP stands for Migrant Protection Protocols, which is a fairly deceiving name. But it's also known as the Remain in Mexico policy. And so what MPP did was, once an asylum seeker went through the process of expressing their fear and it being determined that it was a credible fear in their interview, they were given a court date and then told, okay, go wait in Mexico for your court date. And so you can see here, this is where different MPP courts were operating during MPP. And if we can just reorient ourselves to where Nogales is, if you can see my mouse, it's right here. So starting in January of 2020, asylum seekers were returned to Nogales, but they were told to go to their court date over in Ciudad Juarez, which is about a 12 to 16 hour trip from Nogales. And so during its 2-year existence, about more than 70,000 people along the entire US-Mexico border, that's not specifically Nogales, but rather the entire Mexico border, were sent back to Mexico under MPP and told to await their court hearings there, in perhaps a place where they've already experienced danger and persecution, or where they are likely to, because border towns are incredibly unsafe. And also had this extra obstacle of not being able to find representation because they were in Mexico attempting to find legal representation for their court hearing in the US. And so just to give some statistics as to how many people were able to actually be granted relief as part of MPP, only 4.1% of asylum seekers and migrants who were in attendance were granted relief. Many did not or were not able to attend their court hearings because they couldn't sustain living in a dangerous border town. And so that's something that we've personally seen. People were granted MPP court dates. They then had to wait months and months and months, some now then for over a year, and they had to give up their case and migrate elsewhere to protect themselves from the persecution that they were enduring in Nogales, actually. And then from the individuals in attendance at their MPP hearings with an attorney were 10 times more likely to receive protection. But again, that's a really hard thing to get. Representation is really hard to get when you're told to figure that out from Mexico. And then COVID came. So I think a lot of times when people look at the issue on the border, they think it was a COVID produced situation in some ways, and that COVID is the reason that asylum has been attacked and cut off. And that's partially true, but I think it's important to remember that metering and MPP were both policies that predate COVID. COVID simply exacerbated the situation, and it was the ultimate vehicle for Trump to get the immigration agenda that he wanted. And so what we saw from that were MPP hearings were postponed repeatedly. The metering list in Nogales disappeared. We weren't sure if names were still being added to it, who was controlling it within Nogales, and are still confused as to what will be done with such a list after COVID. And then there were a lot of discrepancies regarding how MPP was applied once borders were closed. But in speaking of border closures, I would like to focus a little bit on that and Title 42 and what that is. And so ever since March of 2020, Title 42 has been in full effect. It was implemented under President Trump as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is not something that Trump created, rather it's a statute that the executive always has at their disposal to implement in times of emergency or perhaps during a pandemic. And so it was implemented with the justification that, okay, right now we cannot process asylum seekers because they are a threat to public health in the US. And that implementation Title 42 continues today, even though public health experts and epidemiologists had that keeping Title 42 in place and denying due process to asylum seekers actually truly is not protecting the US from a potential COVID-19 threat. There are safe and just ways that you can process asylum seekers at ports of entry. And we've seen other realms of society adapt to COVID-19. That can be done at ports of entry as well. However, Title 42 still is in place, and it is specifically the implementation of Title 42 that keeps asylum choked off, because what happens is if someone presents themselves at a port of entry, there's just no processing. There's no wait list to put your name on. Not that we are pro wait list at KBI, but there is no wait list to get on. There's no line to get in. And when you are apprehended perhaps on US soil by Border Patrol, there's no credible fear interview that is happening. Simply, there is no asylum, and it has been like that since March of 2020, and implemented by Trump and now being continued by President Biden, which for us is a concerning message to send, that we are solidifying this reputation that was created under Trump, that the US is okay with returning people to harm and not allowing for the process or processing of asylum. And so what Title 42 looks like, I already jumped into that, being turned away at a port of entry and or expelled if you are apprehended on US soil. So just recapping some of the asylum seeking population before I introduce you to 3 individuals that I hope help humanize these policies. So the asylum seekers that we would be serving at the Kino Border Initiative would be those who were subject to metering lists back in 2019, asylum seekers who were returned to Nogales under MPP starting in January of 2020, and then migrants who have arrived to KBI after March of 2020 and after the implementation of Title 42, who have simply been turned away and or expelled after being apprehended. And so it is specifically this demographic of asylum seekers who, since last August, have organized 6 different protests or marches in downtown Nogales, Sonora. They march through downtown, they march by the port of entry, and then you can see here they finish marching along the wall, and that is the wall that is in the background. And they share their testimonies of what it is that they have endured and why it is that they are seeking asylum in the US. And all that they are asking the US to do is to uphold its own law and to grant due process to asylum seekers who are fleeing some sort of persecution to simply be processed. And that is all they're asking for, to be processed and for the US to follow through on its own word. And so to give you an idea as to who some of the spokeswomen are for the Save Asylum marches or the Save Asylum movement, I first want to introduce you to Esmeralda. She is from Guerrero, Mexico. And just a quick disclaimer that the women that I'm going to share about right now have given me permission to share with you all some of their stories, but we are using not their real names. So Esmeralda is from Guerrero, Mexico. She and her family have been persecuted, and her father-in-law was just assassinated in 2020. But she and her family actually left Guerrero in 2019 and arrived to the US-Mexico border in November of 2019 because they feared that they would experience persecution. And it turns out that they were correct in that. And her father-in-law was not able to escape before he was killed in Guerrero. And so she and her 4 children and her husband and several extended family members are in Nogales and continue to wait in Nogales until they have the option to seek asylum. They put their names on the metering list, and their number was never called before Title 42 was implemented, just several months after their arrival in March of 2020. Elena and Emilio are also coincidentally from Guerrero. Elena suffered sexual abuse in Guerrero, and she came forward about her case and was then persecuted because of that. And so her and her son, who has now celebrated 1 birthday on the US-Mexico border, and so he's 12, they have been there since March of 2020. They arrived right when the border was closed and were turned away at the port of entry because of Title 42. And then lastly, we have Josefa and Lester. Josefa and Lester are from Venezuela. Josefa was an engineer in Venezuela, and she was politically persecuted for her political opinion. And she saw several of her coworkers be disappeared, and fearing that that would happen to her and potentially her son, they fled to the US-Mexico border, and they were given or returned to Nogales under MPP in January of 2020, and they are still waiting to be processed, even though they have an active or an open MPP court date. And so I would like to finish with an announcement, also a video, because personally for me, something that I have found particularly inspiring is the Save Asylum movement that migrants themselves have created and organized. And as a result of so much waiting in Nogales, they have come together as organizers, as activists, to demand and assert their right to seek asylum. And they have organized these marches as part of that. And the video that I'd like to show you here in a second will explain a little bit more about what it's like for them to live in Nogales and why it is that they want to have that opportunity to seek asylum in the US. And so hopefully hearing their voices will humanize a little bit more these very dry policies that or I've just discussed. And hopefully it will inspire you to also follow this movement and follow these women and follow this group of asylum seekers that attend these marches. And hopefully you'll be inspired to attend as well. Our next one is on April 30th, and you can find more information at the link that is there, saveasylum.org. Don't put the hashtag in when you're looking that up, just saveasylum.org. And you can stay tuned to that website, which will have more information in the coming days or in the next week about how to participate in the march virtually, and how to use your own voice to be advocates for women like Esmeralda, Elena, and Josefa, and all of those who are in Nogales and simply waiting for something as simple as the US to uphold their own law. So I'm going to exit this and we'll share the video with you. And then afterwards, I'll turn it back over to Bardis. Let's see. So just to give some context, from August until January, so August of 2020 until January of 2021, asylum seekers organized 6 different marches that I spoke about. And the next one, or the first one of the Biden presidency, will be on April 30th. The last march was on January 19th, so the day before the inauguration, reminding President Biden of some of the promises that he made to asylum seekers and refugees. And we're having our next march on April 30th, because April 30th is the 100th day of the Biden presidency. And we will remind him that during his first 100 days, he did not follow through on some of the things that he did promise. And so reminding him of those and demanding some sort of action and restoration of asylum at the US-Mexico border. And so the footage here that you'll see is from the January 19th march, and the theme was "Not One More Day." And so you'll hear the narrators talk about this idea of please not one more day in Nogales, because living in Nogales for us means, and then they fill in the blank for you. So here you are.
Sarah, the video is not coming through on our end. Would you like trying to reshare screen? Sometimes it doesn't come through unless you're.
Yeah, thanks for interrupting me.
No problem.
Let's see. Give me just a second. You think a year into the pandemic, I would be better.
I know, I still have technical difficulties on my end all the time too.
All right. Can you see a black screen at this point?
Yes, yes.
That's good. That's right.
Okay, thanks for letting me know.
Of course, no problem.
And we'll try again. All right, thank you guys.
Soy Elena, soy solicitante de asilo. Vengo con mi hijo Emilio. He estado en la frontera desde el 16 de marzo del 2020.
Soy Nieves, soy solicitante de asilo. He estado en la frontera de Nogales desde el día 10 de diciembre del 2019.
Soy Esmeralda, solicitante de asilo. He estado en la frontera desde el día 8 de noviembre del 2019.
Un día más de espera aquí en Nogales significa incertidumbre, vivir en el limbo, no saber si vas a comer o no, va a ser frío, tristeza, angustia, desesperación. Y vivir con el temor de que puedan arrebatarte a tu hijo. Ni un día más.
Un día más de espera para mí significa, como madre soltera de 3 niñas de 9, 6 y 3 años, el miedo a salir y no regresar, dejarlas completamente solas en un lugar donde nadie las conoce.
Un día más de espera significa para mí mucho temor porque estoy acá sola, soy una mujer sola. Es muy feo estar en un lugar así, solo, sin contar con nadie. Ni un día más, por favor.
So I hope that that video could at least briefly explain why it is that these women have decided to come forward and to be activists and organizers within this new community that they've now created or been forced to create in Nogales, and that hopefully you'll follow their actions and their movement again at saveasylum.org. I will pass it back over to Bardis so he can continue with his portion of the presentation.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And just a time check for everyone. What we'll try to do here is I'll try to take those powerful images you saw in the folks that the Kino Institute is helping, try to put this into a bigger picture for you all so you can understand how impactful this all really is. I'll try to do that in about 10 or 15 minutes because we want to leave time for questions and answers. For those that didn't see, there's a space for questions and answers in the chat. I see a few of them already. I think I'm going to get to some of those questions right now through my presentation, and then, of course, we'll address any at the end as well. So, you saw pictures of the border wall in Nogales. That border wall continues all the way across. And as you see in San Diego, it goes right into the ocean. That's the border wall here. I don't know if you can see it, just sort of reiterating Sarah's point about a lot of these border towns are very much cross-border towns. Tijuana is right on the other side of the border. What you're looking at here, if I'm not mistaken, is the bullfighting ring in Tijuana. I mean, the city is right here. And this is what we have in our region. And if you, off to the left of this screen, we have a place in San Diego called the Friendship Park. And that's a place where people on the United States side of the border come. They do it they come to this side of the border, and they see their family who have been sent to the other side of the border, and they see each other from across and through this fence. And it is at once one of the more heartbreaking and heartwarming things you'll ever see. And it's part of this sort of dire consequence in the splitting of families that this border wall has caused. And the border wall is totally unnecessary. There's a myth out there that we needed this wall because a porous physical border was a primary driver of illegal immigration. And that's just not true. And it was not true for many years prior to the Trump administration. People overstaying visas far outpace people entering the country without inspection as a driver of what's called unauthorized immigration. This is not a suggestion that we go over people that have overstayed visas either. They also have their own, many are seeking asylum, they stay for their own reasons, but it's just the point that the wall was not necessary. And in fact, according to CBP themselves, unauthorized crossings were down 80%, way down from 2000 when we were seeing really comparatively high numbers even to today by 2015. So it was really not necessary at all. And I pull out the 2019 numbers because the 2019 was actually a peak year, it was sort of a spike year in terms of crossings. So it was higher than the years leading up to 2019 by a lot. But even in 2019, the number of crossers, the number of apprehensions, which is what the administrations usually use to estimate the number of crossers, was half of what it was in 2000. So we're not talking about things we haven't handled as a country before. The other thing to be aware of is the CBP has all kinds of technology at their disposal. There's a virtual wall already. They have thermal imaging, motion sensors, drones, remote cameras, radar, license plate readers. The border area is heavily policed, heavily monitored. And so this wall was always unnecessary and just a giant waste of money, but it drove the agenda that its proponents are trying to drive, that we need to have a wall. What is true is that the demographics of people crossing the border has shifted in the last several decades. So it's a myth that Southwest border crossings were rising. They had been pretty consistent with that spike I mentioned in 2019. But some things were different. There were fewer people for a little more than a decade, fewer people from Mexico were coming across the border. And so in 2000, what you saw was 1.6 million people of Mexican nationality crossing. That number is way down by 2019 to about 166,000. But other countries you saw which were not that high, 28,000 in 2000, now you see larger numbers. And we'll explore a little bit about why that is. You certainly see more families. In 2013, there was about 14,000 families coming through, and in years past, that number was about the same. And I don't know if you all remember during the Obama administration talk of a surge of crossings of children, but that was 2014, and you did start to see a spike of more families coming across the border. And that's been consistent throughout with this large spike in 2019 that I mentioned. I don't put 2020 numbers in here because we'll get into it more, but because of Title 42, no one was being processed or apprehended in the traditional way. So why are we seeing these numbers from, and particularly from Central America? And I don't want to create the impression that Central American migrants are the only ones coming. We, at least from what we see in San Diego, there has always been and continue to be people coming from African countries fleeing violence, from Asian countries fleeing violence, in the Caribbean as well. But focusing on Central America, why are people coming? Well, it's one of the most dangerous places in the world to be. A homicide rate of 61.8 per 100,000 basically means El Salvador is the most dangerous place not in war in the world, and it has been for a long time. Those numbers basically amount to 1 in 2,000. Imagine like a fairly large high school in the United States has about 2,000 people in it. One person in that high school is going to die every year by murder. Would you leave? Would you stay? If you had children, would you leave them in that situation? Honduras has a high rate as well. By comparison, the United States homicide rate is 10 times less. So 1 in 20,000 we're talking about. So of course, this is a place that's perceived as safe. They also don't punish crime there. 95% crime in many of these countries goes unpunished. There's also extortion. Organized crime elements in these sending countries, in the Central American countries, shake down people trying to eke out a living, demand money with harsh consequences for not paying. Some have estimated about 600 million. I think this number's from Guatemala. And that just exacerbates what's already crippling poverty in these countries. These are some of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere and in the world. And that combination of things creates a humanitarian situation where people are more susceptible to violence, more susceptible to threats. And women and children are particularly at risk, and that's why we see more families. El Salvador and Honduras, to take two of the countries, have the 3rd and 5th highest rates of homicides of women in the world. And again, no justice. Can you imagine, out of all those murders, alleged murders, only 5% have resulted in convictions. So there's not only is the violence happening, there's no justice for people. There's no safety built into the systems there. It is unlivable. And what happens if you don't pay your extortion fees? They take your children. They bring your children into the gangs. If they're boys, more often, and if they're girls, they'll be forced into prostitution and taken out of your hands. So they're very much at risk. In just pulling one country out of this, 12,000 victims of sex trafficking a year in Guatemala, about 60% are children. And so when we ask ourselves, why are we seeing more families? This paints the picture of why. And so Sara talked about what these border policies are doing. And I just want to talk a minute about why, let's answer the question, why is it a big deal that we just refuse to process people and we just keep them in Mexico rather than bringing them into the country and process them here? Well, it sends tens of thousands of people more into regions of Mexico that are not, they have no infrastructure for this. You cannot put tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people into places that are not built, that already struggle with providing healthcare and housing and education, and then put these numbers of humanity into those situations where there's no healthcare, not enough housing, not enough education, no employment. And frankly, migrants in these parts of Mexico, they're so vulnerable that then they become specifically targeted for abuse. So it's not just that we're having them wait like a waiting room. We're keeping them in places where what they have to suffer on a human level is, again, unsustainable. And these are folks who have picked up everything, braved a difficult journey through very dangerous circumstances with nothing in their pockets, often to get to our border, think that they are in a place of safety. Most, I would say, are coming to a place where they have family, where they're trying to get to and go through the process from a place of safety. And the minute they reach this beacon on the hill that is our border, they're told to wait. Now we're only talking about 3. I can't go by without saying there were all these other policies that we're not talking about today. There also would be here all day. But there were so many attacks on the asylum program. Family separation, you all know about, I assume. An asylum ban that basically said if you don't present at a port of entry, if you get caught crossing the border, then you're going to be banned from asylum. Well, if you're metering people and you're turning them back and you're not processing them and you're desperate enough, of course they're going to cross between ports of entry. A transit ban that said if you pass through other countries on the way to the border, you're not going to get asylum. An attempt, there was something about this in the chat, an attempt to categorically ban domestic violence survivors from asylum. It was already very difficult to win asylum as a survivor of domestic violence. Whether it falls into a particular social group is a legal question that courts struggle with. But the attempt to ban domestic violence survivors as a categorical matter happened. We've sued, the ACLU has tried to sue pretty much about all of these. And we hope they're going away. And the reason we're talking about these 3 policies today is because they're the ones that don't seem to be going away, or not anytime soon. They're still causing harm. Because it's basically a policy of no process, right? We talked about metering, where people wait for months or longer for their number to be called just to start. And they're, they have to find homes, they have to find food for their children, they have to find a way to survive. In November 2019, that was about 25,000 people on wait lists. That's not a sum, that's a snapshot. So imagine how many people were waiting all together, right? By November 2020, that number was down somewhat, but that number hasn't changed now because of the Title 42 process, lack of process. The same with MPP, you have to wait for your hearing. So now your number finally gets called and now you're waiting for hearing after hearing. You get brought in for your hearing, you get sent back to wait for your next one, which is often months later. And this process can take a really long time. Again, as Sarah mentioned, finding lawyers is next to impossible. We had a lawsuit to try to ensure access to counsel in these cases. That's ongoing. And that process can take a long time. Again, tens of thousands of people, I want to humanize this, but there's literally piling up humanity at the border. More people are coming, people are not being processed, and it's created an unlivable situation on the southern side of our border, on the Mexico side. And again, they're targeted. One study early on in MPP found that 1/3 of people in MPP were specifically targeted with threats, and 1/2 of those were actually beaten, robbed, or extorted. So not only is it dangerous just day to day in terms of surviving food, money, shelter, but you also have to navigate being specific targets for violence in these regions. And we mentioned Title 42, where people are just unilaterally expelled. Those numbers are staggering. 600,000 Title 42 expulsions since March. Now, that's a little bit misleading, and we'll get into it because that's 600,000 expulsions. One of the unique, we used to say apprehensions were a good measure of how many people are crossing. But when you don't process anyone, then they're going to try again because the situation is that desperate. And so it's more of an indicator of how desperate the situation is, that people are turned back, they're forced to wait, they're going to keep trying, and they get turned back and again and again and again. But these are staggering numbers. Now, the Trump administration took a bunch of victory laps saying, well, MPP and metering deterred migration. It's just not true at all. And we're going to show you, graphs, but I'm going to show you a graph that shows it. But as a baseline matter, migration trends are far more complicated. Instability, insecurity. I didn't mention before, environmental impacts like hurricanes and earthquakes also send people. Those are far more determinative of migration flow, and migration flow is seasonal as well. And so the idea of this cause and effect, that someone living in a village suffering persecution in the hills of Guatemala are like paying attention to our policies and deciding whether to come or not come based on that, it's myth. It's absolute myth. Border apprehensions were largely in line throughout. I'm going to show you this graph. I'll help you make sense of it. Each color is a year. And as you go across, that's a month. So this is October of 2015, this green line. And you'll see these seasonal flows that I'm talking about. Year after year, you get a little bit of a downturn in the cold months, a little bit of an upturn in the spring as it gets warmer, and then a little bit of a downturn as you get into the hot months and back into the winter. And that's year after year. Green is 2015, blue, it's higher, but you still see the same trends. Same thing. 2017 is a little bit anomalous, that's yellow. You see a drop when Trump is elected. I think folks are waiting to see what happened, but it comes back up. And by 2018, the gray, you get in the same flow. So it's like clockwork at this point. I want to warn people not to pay attention to headlines that say this month it was higher than last month. Like clockwork at this point, every March, you'll see tweets and public messaging and articles about how the numbers in March were higher than they were in February. The numbers in March are always higher than they were in February. It's just a consistent feature of migration that's a seasonal, predictable pattern. And so the more precise comparison is year over year in months. What was March of this year compared to March of last year? And this month-to-month stuff, just people should get it out of their heads. Now, you see the big elephant in the room, this 2019 spike. We've talked about that. I'm not presumptuous enough to get into cause and effect here, but we talked about the Trump policies and whether they deterred migration. Well, let's put things on the timeline. That's January of 2019 when MPP begins at the San Ysidro border here in San Diego. That didn't deter migration. That's, I don't know if it's cause and effect, but that coincided with the numbers going way up later that year. Okay, so that's not a success. That's not a victory lap for MPP. Around March of that year, Trump threatens to close the border. That doesn't cause people to turn around. That goes up some more into these highs that were first in May of 2019 since 2000. I gotta move my screen out of the way so I can see what I'm doing here. So that's the transit ban I mentioned. That's here in 2019. That's not a cause and effect graph. That downturn was already happening. The asylum ban, that was a little earlier. That was 2018 of November. Again, you don't see any cause and effect from these policies. This is metering in San Ysidro. We started this, lots of things get tested out here at San Diego. This is February of 2016. Again, you do not see a cause and effect of deterrence. And then you see metering start to go across the border. This is like April of 2018. You start to see it go across the border even more. Sarah mentioned when it starts in Nogales. It is, as she mentioned, it starts in certain places, they implement it, and then they spread it across the border. But again, and also this is around when family separation went on steroids. This is when zero tolerance happened. And the idea that there's cause and effect does not borne out by the numbers. That's a myth. So I'll just wrap up by obviously what's in the news a lot is it a crisis now at the border? And the answer is this has been brewing for a long time because of these policies. The backlog of humanity at the border didn't just go away. People didn't go home. They were desperate. They're trying to get safe. They're waiting and waiting. So yes, it's true that apprehension rates in February and March of this past year have gone up, and everyone's, people on the anti-immigrant agenda are trying to set off alarm bells, but this is just people that have been waiting a long time. And as I mentioned, this is a lot of repeat crossers, these high numbers. And so we shouldn't read too much into these high numbers right now. So this myth that Biden's open border policy, Sarah, I just shot down the myth that there's any open border policies at all. Very effectively. But the idea that these open border policies of the Biden administration are causing a surge in migration is a myth. There are, in these last 2 months, a larger number of apprehensions. That's not unprecedented when you compare it to the early 2000s, certainly. So it's not anything that this country hasn't experienced before. And when you account for repeat crossers, the flow of migration is actually pretty consistent with where it had been. This is the last graph, I promise you. But the gray line here is the number of apprehensions, which, as I mentioned, has always tracked with the number of actual crossers, right? The blue is when you factor out, and this was done by the Cato Institute. I can't say I worked these numbers myself, but the blue is if you take first-time crossers into account, that's blue. And you start to see this separation, right? And in March, this is February where this graph ends. In March, it does go up again, and the separation goes up again. And that just shows you that more and more people are crossing and trying again because the situation is that desperate. There is only so long someone can wait with their children, homeless and without money and without food and without education and being targeted by violence. And so when you don't process people, they take matters into their own hands. Of course they do, trying to get to a place of safety. Now, a couple of new trends you hear in the news, there are more children traveling alone that are being apprehended and processed. And that's just because one thing the Biden administration has done is actually process them. So in 2020, the Trump administration did not even process children. They Title 42'd even children who are traveling alone. At least as an initial step, the Biden administration has stopped doing that. And so that's why you're seeing this news about children being held in processing centers. Right? These are decently large numbers in terms of children, but think about the alternative. These children were being forced to wait and navigate most of them, a foreign country for them. And so it is a step in the right direction that we're processing these children. Just so people understand the process there, children have to be first processed by Customs and Border Protection. That's supposed to happen quickly. They then have to be moved to the Department of Health and Human Services, where they're supposed to be in shelters that provide for their educational needs, and they're supposed to have their sponsors vetted. That's a system that when it's working, it can work well. But the infrastructure to handle these numbers doesn't exist. So in terms of solutions moving forward, we really have to invest in processing capability. Kids should not be in these CBP hieleras, we call them, everyone calls them hieleras, the ice boxes, often for days and weeks waiting for a HHS shelter bed to open up or a sponsor bed to open up. It's really problematic, and it's a matter of political will to build this structure. But it does represent a step in alleviating what has been a building humanitarian crisis on the Mexican side of the border. It's not causing one. The other trend you start to see, and I'll just be quick about this one, you do see more Mexican adults crossing compared to what I showed you earlier, the downturn of Mexican adults crossing over the last decade or more. So those numbers are up, but again, and this about double, but again, these are a lot of repeat crossers. And the reason you start to see that is because some of the same push factors that drive Central American migration that we talked about, they're increasingly present in Mexico too. So there was a question in the chat about how dangerous it is in these countries, and we touched on it already. But here's the homicide rate in Mexico is getting 39 is a record high for them. In Chihuahua and Baja, they're border towns where a lot of these migrants are being forced to wait. They're up to 70 in terms of their homicide rates. They're very, very deadly places to be. And the other thing about Mexico that's sending people is that Mexico is one of the hardest hit countries in the world when it comes to COVID, both in terms of health and economy. And so that's another push factor. And so what's the message here as we wrap up? Well, humane solutions are possible. We just need the political will for them. Okay, that's us. That's you. That's the people you talk to. That's all of us. It's our job to put the pressure on the powers that be to live up to our humane values. There's steps in the right direction. I would call them baby steps at best, but at least they're steps. Sara has, again, put into perspective what has not happened, and it's a lot that has not. But at least they've stopped applying Title 42 to children. They've announced they will not apply MPP going forward, but that didn't process the people that have still been waiting. They're doing that, but they're doing that extremely slowly. And so, a couple dozen a day doesn't put a real dent in what's happening on the other side of the borders. And the backlog continues. So there's still a lot of work to do. In San Diego, we've tried to invest. We're fortunate to have some resources and some political movement in the right direction. And at least when it comes to processing families, we're doing something I think we can be proud of here. CBP coordinates and works hand in hand, not always, I shouldn't say hand in hand like they didn't come kicking and screaming, but they are coordinating a little bit more with NGOs, groups like Sarah's, but ours here, to process families. So CBP processes them, takes their basic information, and then a local nonprofit, Jewish Family Services here in San Diego, has set up a shelter on the US side of the border where they can get tested, they can wait out their quarantine period or get a negative test, they can get their sponsorship information processed. JFS helps them identify where they're going, who their sponsors are going to be, and helps them arrange travel, and then gets them to the airport or bus stop or wherever they're going so they can get to their family member and have the asylum process from a place of safety. And that it's been a lot. Our partners at JFS are enduring a lot, and they need an influx of there's not a lot of resources there, and they're all working around the clock, as I know, and I'm sure folks in Arizona and Texas are doing the same. But these sort of humanitarian solutions are possible. And so the final point is circling back to this question I posed at the beginning: which country are we? Are we the welcoming country, or are we the country that attacks immigrants first when things go bad? Which is fact and which is myth? And I would say that for me, they're both fact. At our best, we welcome people, particularly people seeking our safety. And at our worst, as a country, we victimize them, we target them, we don't process them. And the way we get to our best is political will. It's political will. It takes work, because we were, going back even farther, it's a fact that we were a country founded by white men who espoused freedom while denying the vote to women and while treating Black people as property. That's a fact, right? Even though we have these values of freedom. But it's also a fact that we are a diverse country. We are a welcoming country at the best, among the best of us, right? And if we work hard, we can have our government and our policies reflect the best of us. But it takes that work. It takes all of us working together, supporting things like supporting groups like Sarah, supporting the Save Asylum movement, supporting these organizations that are really trying to lift up and be a guiding light and live up to the American ideal that I think we all want to be. And so that is it. And I think what we'll do now is I'll stop sharing. And we can, I don't know if someone wants to try to moderate or go through the questions, but I think we'll open it up to questions now. To make sure we get your
Bardis,
questions
thank
answered.
you. Thank you so much to both of you. I'm almost speechless because there was so much to absorb, but it was so helpful to really, so many of us have a general idea and, that's gleaned from the news media, and to really, dive deep into a specific area and see it in perspective and from a humane point of view, and not just humane in terms of attitude, but in terms of action. I really thank both of you so much. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the only question, please, I encourage anyone else who has a question to put it in the chat now. You addressed my question about victims of domestic violence. I think Annette had a question about the dangers of border towns, which you also addressed. Judith McQuistion had a fairly specific question. Does the potential exist for a lawsuit to appeal Title 42 based on the paroling of people previously in MPP who are tested for COVID during the process? I think you touched on that with what Jewish Family Services is doing for children, but I think this is a more general question.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding it right, the question is there potential to sue to stop Title 42? If I'm not understanding the question, someone let me know. But there's a lot to sue about. There's a lot of these inhumane processes happening, so there's a practical issue. The idea to sue on a public health, what's categorized as a public health policy is difficult. Courts are as a lawyer, I will tell you this 100%, they're the worst way to solve a problem. They are what you do when there's not enough political will, when there's not when the situation is desperate that you need a court to step in. And courts, particularly for public health situations, are reluctant to come in and overstep government decisions that public health requires X, Y, and Z. So there are lawsuits. There is a lawsuit challenging Title 42 as applies to children. Our national office has one ongoing right now. So that exists. But the other thing about courts is they move slow. And during this process, people are experiencing this inhumanity, this degradation every day. What really is the best way to affect change is political will, is to have the powers that be hear loud and clear from the people that will or will not vote for them, that we demand this to be changed. Whatever the world looked like in March of 2020, when no one knew anything about testing or how to stop this, that's a different world now. There's ways to process people humanely, even amid the pandemic. And to continue to use public health as an excuse to refuse any process for people isn't excusable anymore. There are ways to do it. And so I think it's a matter of a political movement hand in hand with whatever litigation we can muster that might or might not be successful.
Thank you very much, Judith. I hope that answered your question. I know you said that many parents are having to make a Sophie's choice because of Title 42, which is so devastating.
Yeah, and that's exactly the right way to put it, right? There's no good choices here.
But I'm pleased that you ended on a, if not totally positive, a balanced note in terms of the attempt to ameliorate the situation, which is incredibly complex. And thank you for demystifying and demythologizing much of it for us today. It's been such a pleasure working with and having both of you here today. I wish you both tremendous success and good luck going forward. Sara, in your next steps in your humanitarian journey, and Bardis in your legal journey with ACLU. I'm just seeing, people are sending their thanks to you both, and we added as well. I put in the chat some upcoming programs that have been inspired by Border Cantos Sonic Border. If there's too much to digest right now, please do go to our calendar, and they'll be described there. And I do recommend hopping on and registering for the film Nómadas, which we are providing through basically a password protected link for people to preview prior to its international release, about the very issue of migration being a universal one throughout nature. Everyone, thank you again so much for being with us today. And again, to Bardis, to Sara, Olivia, thank you. Maria, thank you for making this such a wonderful program. And have a great rest of the weekend, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Take care.